The autumn rain drummed against the cracked window panes of Ashworth Manor, each drop echoing through the nearly empty halls like a funeral march. Lady Elena Ashworth pressed her forehead against the cold glass, watching the water streak down in rivulets that mirrored the tears she refused to shed. Behind her, the physician's words still rang in her ears with the finality of a death sentence. "The fever has settled deep in his lungs, my lady. Without the specialized treatment available only in the Royal Capital's Medical College, I fear young Master Marcus has perhaps 3 months, maybe less." Elena's reflection stared back at her from the window, a woman of 28, with premature worry lines etched around green eyes that had once sparkled with hope. Her auburn hair, once her pride, now hung in a simple braid, practical rather than beautiful. The fine silk gowns had been sold months ago, replaced by serviceable wool that spoke of their reduced circumstances. She turned from the window to face the sparse sitting room. Once, these walls had been adorned with tapestries depicting her late husband's family lineage. Now only faded rectangles on the wallpaper marked where they had hung before being sold to pay the mounting debts. The fire in the hearth had burned low, coal was expensive, and winter was coming. "Mama?" The small voice from the doorway made Elena's heart clench. Marcus stood there, wrapped in a thick quilt that dwarfed his slight frame. At 8 years old, he should have been robust and energetic, racing through these halls with wooden swords and dreams of knighthood. Instead, the illness had left him pale and fragile, his dark eyes too large in his thin face. "You should be resting, my darling," Elena said, forcing brightness into her voice as she moved to kneel beside him. His skin felt warm to her touch, the fever that never seemed to break completely. "I heard voices. Was that Dr. Whitmore?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying a wisdom beyond his years. Living with illness had aged him in ways that broke Elena's heart daily. "Yes, he was just checking on you," she replied, smoothing his dark hair back from his forehead. How could she tell him what the doctor had really said? How could she explain that the treatment he needed would cost more than their estate was worth, if anyone would even buy it in its current condition? "Mama, am I going to die?" The question, asked so simply, so directly, nearly shattered Elena's composure. She pulled him close, breathing in the scent of his hair, feeling the rapid flutter of his heartbeat against her chest. "No," she whispered fiercely. "No, my brave boy. Mama will find a way, I promise you that." It was a promise that terrified her even as she made it. But as she held her son, her reason for living, the last piece of her beloved Thomas she had left, Elena felt something harden in her chest. Desperation, yes, but also determination. She had been a dutiful daughter, a loving wife, a devoted mother. She had followed every rule, observed every propriety, and where had it led? To watching her child fade away while creditors circled like vultures. That night, after Marcus had fallen into a fitful sleep, Elena sat at her late husband's desk in what had once been his study. By candlelight, she spread out the few letters and documents that held any value. Birth certificates, marriage lines, the deed to the manor, everything that proved her identity and status. Lady Elena Ashworth. The title still carried some weight, even if the lands that came with it were mortgaged beyond redemption. She was still nobility, even if barely. Still young enough to be considered marriageable, even if her circumstances were desperate. An idea began to form, terrifying, audacious, but perhaps the only chance Marcus had. The rumors about King Adrian Blackthorne were known throughout the kingdom. The Frost King, they called him, though never to his face. At 34, he had ruled for 6 years with an iron fist and an ice-cold heart. Ever since the death of his queen in childbirth had left him bitter and withdrawn. The kingdom prospered under his rule, but at court they whispered about his cruelty, his impossible standards, his complete emotional detachment. They also whispered that he was looking for a new wife, not for love. Everyone knew Adrian Blackthorne was incapable of that now, but for political alliance, a strategic marriage to strengthen his position and secure the succession. Elena's hand trembled as she reached for a sheet of parchment. What she was considering was madness. A woman of her humble status approaching the king directly. It was unprecedented, potentially treasonous, but traditional channels had failed her. The local lords had their own problems, and none had funds to spare for the treatment Marcus needed. She dipped her quill in ink, her heart pounding as she began to write. Your Majesty King Adrian Blackthorne. Chapter 2. The Frost King's Court. The throne room of Castle Ravenshollow stretched out like a cathedral of power, its vaulted ceilings disappearing into shadows that seemed to swallow sound and warmth alike. Massive stone pillars carved with the kingdom's history rose from a floor of polished black marble, and tall windows cast pale autumn light across the assembled courtiers who waited in nervous silence. King Adrian Blackthorn sat upon the iron throne of Aldermere, a magnificent construction of dark steel and obsidian that had been passed down through 15 generations of his bloodline. But it was not the throne that commanded attention, it was the man who occupied it. At 34, Adrian possessed the kind of commanding presence that made grown men step back without conscious thought. Tall and broad-shouldered, with hair as black as a winter night and eyes the color of storm clouds, he wore his authority like armor. His face was aristocratic, handsome in a harsh way, with sharp cheekbones and a mouth that seemed carved from stone. Those who had known him before his wife's death claimed he had once smiled, even laughed. Now, 6 years later, such expressions seemed as foreign to his features as warmth to winter. "Your Majesty," Lord Chancellor Garrett Weston approached the throne with careful steps, a leather portfolio clutched in his weathered hands. "The morning petitions await your attention." Adrian's gaze never wavered from the middle distance, as if he were seeing through the assembled courtiers rather than at them. "Proceed." Lord Weston cleared his throat and opened the portfolio. First, a dispute between Lord Harrington and Lord Mills regarding water rights to the River Ashford. Both parties claim historical precedent. Harrington's claim predates Mills by 3 generations. Verdict in his favor. Next. The speed of the decision sent a murmur through the court. Lord Mills's representative opened his mouth to protest, then wisely closed it under the king's glacial stare. A petition from the Merchants' Guild requesting reduced tariffs on imported spices from the southern kingdoms. Denied. The Treasury requires those funds for the northern fortifications. Next. A request for royal arbitration in a marriage contract dispute between House Blackwood and House Stirling. Let them settle it themselves, or live with their poor judgment. Next. Lord Weston hesitated, his finger tracing down the list. "There is an unusual petition, Your Majesty, a direct appeal from Lady Elena Ashworth of Ashworth Manor." For the first time that morning, Adrian's attention seemed to sharpen slightly. "Ashworth? I'm not familiar with the name." "A minor noble house, Your Majesty. Her late husband, Sir Thomas Ashworth, held a small estate in the eastern reaches. The lady, she requests a private audience." "On what grounds?" She proposes a matter of mutual benefit regarding a strategic alliance." The throne room fell silent. Direct petitions from minor nobility were rare enough. One proposing a strategic alliance bordered on presumptuous. Several courtiers exchanged glances, anticipating the swift dismissal that would surely follow. Adrian studied the parchment that Lord Weston held, though he made no move to take it. Her credentials? Widowed 6 years, one son, age 8. The estate is in some financial difficulty, Your Majesty. A cold smile touched the king's lips, not of warmth, but of bitter amusement. Another impoverished noble seeking royal charity. "Have the usual response sent—" "Your Majesty," Lord Weston interrupted carefully. "Forgive me, but perhaps you should read the petition yourself. Her approach is unconventional." Something in the Chancellor's tone gave Adrian pause. In 6 years of rule, Garrett Weston had never advocated for reading a petitioner's letter without good reason. Adrian held out his hand, and Weston approached to place the parchment in it. Adrian read in silence, his expression revealing nothing. But those who knew him well, and there were few, might have noticed the slight narrowing of his eyes, the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. "Your Majesty King Adrian Blackthorn, I am Lady Eleanor Ashworth, widow of Sir Thomas Ashworth, mother to Marcus Ashworth, heir to Ashworth Manor. I write not to beg for charity, but to propose a transaction that may benefit us both. I am aware that your Majesty seeks a strategic marriage alliance. I am aware also that such alliances typically involve great houses with substantial dowries and political connections. I possess neither. What I offer instead is something perhaps more valuable. Absolute loyalty, born not of political maneuvering, but of genuine gratitude. My son is dying, Your Majesty. The treatment he requires exists only in the royal capital and is beyond my current means. I am prepared to enter into marriage with you, to serve as your queen in whatever capacity you require, in exchange for my son's life and future security. I make this offer with full understanding that it would be a transaction, nothing more. I expect no affection, no companionship beyond what duty requires. I am educated, well-mannered, and capable of fulfilling the ceremonial duties of queenship. Most importantly, I would be forever in your debt, a loyalty that cannot be purchased or politically negotiated away. If this proposal holds any interest, I await your command. Your humble servant, Lady Elena Ashworth. Adrian read the letter twice, his face remaining impassive. Around him the court waited in tense silence. Finally, he looked up at Lord Weston. "Bring her to court," he said quietly. "Tomorrow." The Chancellor bowed. "Yes, Your Majesty. Shall I arrange guest quarters?" "No." Adrian's voice cut across the room like a blade. "One audience. She will state her case, I will give my decision, and she will depart the same day." As the court proceedings continued, Adrian found his thoughts returning to the letter. Not because of any romantic inclination, that part of him had died with Isabella 6 years ago, but because of its unusual honesty. In a world of courtly games and hidden motives, Lady Eleanor Ashworth had laid her desperation bare with startling clarity. Most intriguing of all, she asked for nothing but her son's life. No titles, no lands, no promises of affection, just a transaction, as she had called it. Perhaps it was time to consider such pragmatism in his own strategic planning. Chapter 3. The Journey to Fate. The dawn mist clung to the cobblestones of the royal capital like ghostly fingers as Elena's borrowed carriage rattled through the narrow streets toward Castle Ravenshollow. She had left Marcus in the care of Mrs. Holloway, their loyal housekeeper who had refused to abandon them even when the wages stopped coming months ago. The memory of her son's fever-bright eyes as she kissed his forehead goodbye still burned in her chest. "We're here to save you," she whispered to the morning air, her breath forming small clouds in the cold. Whatever the cost. The capital city of Ravenshollow sprawled around the base of the castle like a living thing, its streets teeming with merchants, craftsmen and nobles going about their daily business. Elena pressed her face to the carriage window, marveling at the prosperity she witnessed. Baker shops with fresh bread steaming in their windows, cloth merchants displaying fine silks and wool, children playing in the streets with rosy cheeks and bright eyes, so different from the struggling villages near her estate. This was what strong leadership brought, she realized. King Adrian might be called the Frost King, but his realm flourished under his rule. Perhaps there was wisdom in his coldness, a necessary distance that allowed him to make decisions for the good of many, rather than the comfort of few. The carriage began its ascent up the winding road to the castle, and Elena's courage nearly faltered. Castle Ravenshollow rose from the mountainside like a testament to royal power, its black stone walls seeming to absorb the morning light rather than reflect it. Towers pierced the sky like accusing fingers, and the great gate stood open like a mouth ready to devour all who entered. Eleanor smoothed her hands over her dress, her finest remaining gown of deep blue wool, carefully mended where time and wear had taken their toll. She had braided her hair in an elaborate pattern that had taken her an hour to perfect, and wore her mother's pearl earrings, the last jewelry she hadn't been forced to sell. She needed to look like a lady worthy of a king's consideration, even if her purse suggested otherwise. "Lady Ashworth," the carriage driver's voice startled her from her thoughts. "We've arrived at the main gates." Through the window, Elena saw guards in the royal colors of black and silver approaching the carriage. Their armor was polished to perfection, their expressions professionally neutral but alert. One stepped forward as the carriage came to a halt. "State your business," the guard commanded, his voice carrying the authority of one accustomed to being obeyed. "Lady Elena Ashworth, here by royal summons for an audience with His Majesty," Elena called through the window, proud that her voice remained steady despite the hammering of her heart. The guard consulted a scroll, then nodded. "You are expected, my lady. Captain Morrison will escort you to the throne room." As Eleanor stepped from the carriage, she felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her. Servants, guards, and minor courtiers had paused in their duties to observe the arrival of the mysterious petitioner who had somehow secured a personal audience with the king. She lifted her chin and straightened her shoulders, drawing upon every lesson in deportment her mother had drilled into her years ago. Captain Morrison, a weathered man with greying temples and kind eyes, offered her his arm. "This way, my lady. His Majesty does not like to be kept waiting." They walked through corridors that seemed to stretch forever, past tapestries depicting great battles and royal portraits whose eyes seemed to follow Elena's progress. The castle's wealth was overwhelming: gold leaf on carved moldings, precious stones set into decorative shields, floors so polished they reflected the light from crystal chandeliers like mirrors. "A word of advice, if I may, my lady," Captain Morrison said quietly as they approached the great doors of the throne room. "His Majesty appreciates directness. Courtly flourishes and flowery language tend to irritate him." Eleanor nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Captain. I will remember that." The massive doors swung open, and Elena stepped into the throne room she had only heard described in whispered stories. The reality far exceeded her imagination. The space was vast enough to hold her entire manor house, its stone pillars rising like ancient trees toward a ceiling lost in shadows. And there, at the far end on a throne that seemed carved from midnight itself, sat King Adrian Blackthorne. Even at a distance, his presence was magnetic and terrible. Elena had prepared herself for a powerful man, but the reality of being in the same room with him made her feel like a candle flame in a winter storm. She began the long walk across the marble floor, her footsteps echoing in the vast space, aware that every eye in the court was fixed upon her. As she drew closer, the details of the king's appearance became clearer, and Elena found herself fighting the urge to look away from the intensity of his gaze. He was handsome, she realized with surprise, not in the soft, courtly way of many nobles, but with a harsh, masculine beauty that spoke of strength and authority. His black hair was perfectly styled, his jaw clean-shaven, his posture that of a man who had never doubted his right to command. But it was his eyes that held her attention, grey as storm clouds, cold as winter ice, and completely, utterly emotionless as they studied her approach. When she reached the prescribed distance from the throne, Elena sank into the deepest curtsy she could manage, her skirts pooling around her like water. "Your Majesty, Lady Ashworth." His voice was deep, cultured, and as cold as his reputation suggested. "Rise." Eleanor stood, meeting his gaze directly, despite the intimidation factor. "In for a penny, in for a pound," as Mrs. Holloway would say. "You have traveled far for this audience," King Adrian continued. "Speak." Chapter 4. The Coldest Negotiation. The throne room fell silent except for the distant sound of wind through the high windows. Elena felt the weight of every gaze upon her, courtiers, guards, advisers, all waiting to see how a minor noble would address their formidable king. But all that mattered were the storm-grey eyes fixed upon her with calculating intensity. "Your Majesty," Elena began, her voice carrying clearly through the vast space, "I come before you not as a supplicant, but as a woman with something to offer." A murmur rippled through the assembled court. Such directness was rarely heard in these halls, where every word was typically wrapped in layers of courtly politeness and hidden meaning. King Adrian's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, interest perhaps, or approval of her boldness. "Continue." Eleanor clasped her hands in front of her, drawing strength from the memory of Marcus's trusting face. "I am a widow with a dying child, and an estate in ruins. By any measure, I should be begging for your charity. Instead, I offer you a marriage alliance that serves us both." "You presume to know what serves me," Adrian said, his voice carrying a warning edge that made several courtiers shift nervously. "I presume nothing, Your Majesty, but I observe that you have ruled for 6 years without remarrying, despite pressure from your council to secure the succession. I believe this suggests you require something different from what traditional alliances offer." Lord Chancellor Weston leaned forward slightly, his expression fascinated by this unprecedented exchange. Even he had never seen anyone speak so directly to the king. "And what do you believe I require?" Adrian asked, leaning back in his throne with the casual grace of a predator, settling in to study its prey. Elena took a breath, knowing her next words would either save her son or damn them both. "You require a wife who will not expect love, who will not burden you with emotional demands, who will fulfill her duties without complaint and ask for nothing beyond those duties. You require someone whose loyalty is absolute, not because of political calculation, but because of genuine unpayable debt." The silence that followed was absolute. Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat in her ears as she waited for the king's response. Around the throne room, courtiers stood frozen, hardly daring to breathe. Adrian studied her for a long moment, his fingers steepled before his lips. "You speak of loyalty born of gratitude. How can you guarantee such a thing?" "Because, Your Majesty, If you save my son's life, I will owe you everything that matters to me in this world. That kind of debt cannot be forgotten or forgiven. It becomes part of one's very soul. And what of your son? A stepchild to a king who has no particular fondness for children. Elena's composure nearly cracked at the question, but she forced herself to remain steady. Marcus is dying, Your Majesty. If you provide the treatment he needs, he will live. That alone is more than any stepfather has ever given a child. I ask for nothing more. No titles, no inheritance, no claim to succession. Simply life. Adrian rose from his throne, and Elena was struck by the full impact of his height and presence. He descended the steps slowly, each footfall echoing in the vast chamber, until he stood mere feet from her. Up close, she could see the lines around his eyes, the slight silver threading through his black hair, the way his jaw seemed permanently set in hard lines. "You interest me, Lady Ashworth," he said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone, though the acoustics carried his words to the farthest corners of the room. "But marriage is not a transaction one enters lightly, regardless of the circumstances. I understand completely, Your Majesty." "Do you?" He began to circle her slowly, like a hawk studying prey. "Do you understand that as my queen, you would be expected to produce heirs? That your body would no longer belong to you alone?" Heat rose in Elena's cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. "I understand the duties of a wife, Your Majesty. Do you understand that I am not a gentleman? That I have no patience for tears, tantrums, or emotional displays of any kind? I would not presume to burden you with such things. Do you understand that once you enter into this arrangement, there would be no escape? No divorce, no annulment, no retreat to your quiet country life when the reality of royal duty becomes overwhelming?" Eleanor met his eyes directly. "I understand that my son's life depends upon my complete commitment to this arrangement. That is motivation enough to ensure I never seek escape." Adrian completed his circle and stood before her again. The court held its collective breath as he studied her face with those penetrating grey eyes. "You claim to ask for nothing beyond your son's treatment," he said finally, "but every woman wants something. What is it you're not telling me?" The question was so unexpected, so perceptive, that Elena felt her careful composure waver for just a moment. She thought of Thomas, of the love they had shared, of the dreams they had built together before illness took him. She thought of the loneliness that had been her companion for 6 long years, of the nights she had lain awake wondering if she would ever again feel truly connected to another human being. But those were luxuries she could no longer afford. "I want my son to live, Your Majesty. Everything else is secondary." Something in her voice must have convinced him, because Adrian nodded slowly. "Very well. I will consider your proposal. You will remain at court for 3 days while I make my decision. Lord Chancellor Weston will arrange appropriate quarters." Elena's knees nearly buckled with relief, but she managed another curtsy. "Thank you, Your Majesty." "Do not thank me yet," Adrian said, turning back toward his throne. "You may find that getting what you wish for is not the blessing you imagine it to be." As Elena was escorted from the throne room, she caught a glimpse of the king settling back onto his throne, his expression as cold and remote as ever. But she had seen something in his eyes during their exchange, a flicker of what might have been curiosity, or perhaps recognition of a kindred spirit, who understood that sometimes survival required the hardest choices of all. 3 days to wait. 3 days to discover whether her desperate gamble would save Marcus or destroy them both. Chapter 5. 3 days in golden shadow. The guest chambers assigned to Elena were more luxurious than any space she had occupied in years, yet she found no comfort in their opulence. Silk hangings in deep burgundy-framed windows that overlooked the castle's extensive gardens, and a fire crackled warmly in a marble hearth carved with intricate rose motifs. The bed could have slept 4 people comfortably, draped in velvet curtains and piled high with down pillows. But luxury could not quiet the anxiety that gnawed at her every waking moment. Elena stood at the window watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, her 3rd morning at court. Today, King Adrian would give his decision. Today, she would learn whether her desperate gamble had saved Marcus or condemned them both to a different kind of ruin. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Enter," she called, expecting one of the silent servants who had been attending to her needs with professional efficiency. Instead, a woman near her own age swept into the room, her silk gown rustling with every step. She was beautiful in the way that court ladies often were, perfectly coiffed golden hair, porcelain skin, and jewelry that could have fed Elena's estate for a year, but her blue eyes held a sharpness that spoke of intelligence and curiosity. "Lady Ashworth," the woman said with a smile that seemed genuine despite its calculation, "I am Lady Catherine Hartwell, Duchess of Millbrook. I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I simply had to meet the woman who has set the court buzzing with speculation." Eleanor curtsied politely. "Your Grace, I'm honored by your visit. Oh, please, let's dispense with formalities. May I?" Catherine gestured toward the sitting area, and Eleanor nodded. As they settled into chairs by the fire, Catherine studied Elena with unconcealed fascination. "You've created quite a stir, you know," Catherine said, accepting the tea that Elena poured from the service that had appeared with breakfast. "No one can quite decide what to make of you. A minor noble who secures a private audience with the king, who speaks to him as if she were his equal. Fascinating. I spoke to His Majesty with the respect due his position," Elena said carefully, unsure where this conversation was leading. Catherine laughed, a sound like silver bells. "My dear, I've been at this court for 8 years. I've seen duchesses reduced to stammering children in Adrian's presence. What you displayed in that throne room wasn't mere respect. It was courage, or desperation so complete it masqueraded as courage." Elena sipped her tea, saying nothing. Catherine's eyes gleamed with approval at her silence. "Wise of you not to confide in a stranger," Catherine continued, "but I'm not here to pry secrets from you. I'm here because I believe you may actually succeed in this mad venture of yours." "Succeed? In marrying the Frost King?" Catherine leaned forward conspiratorially. "Do you know what the court has been saying these past 3 days? That Adrian has been different. Oh, still cold as winter, still terrifying in his authority. But there's been something in his demeanor, a kind of focused attention that suggests you've captured his interest in a way no one has managed since Isabella's death." The mention of the late Queen made Eleanor's stomach tighten. She had heard the stories, how Adrian and Isabella had been childhood friends who grew into devoted lovers, how her death in childbirth had turned him from a merely stern king into the emotionless ruler he was now. "I make no claims to have captured anything," Elena said quietly. "I simply offered a practical solution to mutual needs." "And that," Catherine said with a knowing smile, "may be precisely what he's been waiting for. Adrian Blackthorne is not a man who believes in love anymore, but he understands duty, loyalty, and practical arrangements. You've spoken his language." Their conversation was interrupted by another knock. This time it was Lord Chancellor Weston, his expression grave as he entered with a formal bow. "Lady Ashworth, Your Grace," he said, acknowledging Catherine with a nod. "His Majesty requests Lady Ashworth's presence in his private study immediately." Eleanor's heart leaped into her throat. This was it, the moment that would determine everything. She rose on unsteady legs, her hands smoothing automatically over her skirts. "Courage," Catherine whispered as Eleanor passed her chair. "Whatever happens, you've already proven yourself remarkable." Elena followed Lord Weston through corridors she was beginning to recognize, but instead of heading toward the throne room, he led her to a smaller, more intimate part of the castle. They stopped before a heavy oak door carved with the royal coat of arms. "His Majesty is within," Weston said simply, then stepped aside. Eleanor took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and knocked. Enter. Chapter 6. The Frost King's Choice King. Adrian's private study was a revelation that caught Elena entirely off guard. She had expected something formal and intimidating, befitting the man who ruled from the fearsome throne of black steel. Instead, she found herself in a space that was unmistakably personal, lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound books, furnished with comfortable chairs worn smooth by use, and warmed by a fire that cast dancing shadows across maps spread over a massive desk. Adrian stood with his back to her, staring out a window that offered a commanding view of his kingdom. Without the formal robes of state, dressed instead in a simple white shirt and dark trousers, he seemed more human somehow, still imposing, but less like a force of nature and more like a man bearing the weight of enormous responsibility. "Close the door," he said without turning around. Eleanor obeyed, then waited in silence. She had learned enough about him to know that rushing to speak would be a mistake. "Do you know what I've been doing these past 3 days?" Adrian asked, still facing the window. "No, Your Majesty. I've been investigating you." He turned then, fixing her with those penetrating grey eyes. "Every detail of your life, your marriage, your circumstances. I've spoken to your late husband's former comrades, to merchants who have dealt with your estate, to the physician who treats your son." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice steady. "And what did you discover? That you are exactly what you appeared to be in my throne room, a woman telling the truth out of desperate necessity." Adrian moved to his desk, picking up a sheet of parchment. "Dr. Whitmore confirms your son's condition is as grave as you claimed. Your estate's financial records show debts that would indeed make his treatment impossible. Your reputation is that of a devoted mother and a woman of integrity, if perhaps too trusting in business matters." "I never claimed to be a shrewd businesswoman, Your Majesty." "No, you didn't. You claimed to be a woman who would be grateful enough to serve loyally as my queen." Adrian set down the parchment and studied her face. "The question is whether such an arrangement would benefit the kingdom, as well as your son." Elena's heart pounded, but she forced herself to meet his gaze directly. "And what conclusion have you reached?" Adrian was quiet for a long moment, and Elena noticed details she hadn't seen before, the slight lines of fatigue around his eyes, the way his jaw tightened as if he were fighting some internal battle, the careful control he maintained over every expression. "I have concluded," he said finally, "that a marriage based on mutual benefit rather than fleeting emotion may indeed serve both our purposes." He moved closer, and Elena caught the scent of leather and something masculine that made her pulse quicken unexpectedly. "But I want to be absolutely clear about what you are agreeing to." "I'm listening, Your Majesty." "If you become my queen, you will be expected to fulfill every duty that position entails. You will bear my heirs if God wills it. You will represent the crown with dignity at all public functions. You will support my decisions without question, even when they are harsh or unpopular. And you will do all of this without expecting affection, companionship, or emotional intimacy beyond what is strictly necessary." Elena swallowed hard. "I understand. Do you? Because I want no misunderstandings, no secret hopes that I might soften toward you over time. I am not the man I was before Isabella died. That capacity for love, for tenderness, it died with her. I will never offer you what your first marriage gave you." The words hit Elena like physical blows, but she had known this was the bargain she was making. "I ask for none of those things, Your Majesty. I ask only for my son's life." Adrian studied her face intently, as if searching for any sign of deception or hidden agenda. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him, because he nodded slowly. "Very well. I accept your proposal, Lady Ashworth. We will be married in 1 month's time. Your son will be brought to the capital immediately, and will receive the finest medical care available. He will be raised as a prince of this realm, though he will hold no claim to succession." Elena's knees nearly buckled with relief. Marcus would live. Whatever else happened, Marcus would live. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion she struggled to contain. "Your Majesty, I cannot express—" "Don't." Adrian's voice cut across her gratitude like a blade. "This is a transaction, remember. I'm gaining a queen who will serve my purposes. You are gaining your son's life. No thanks are necessary." Eleanor composed herself, recognizing the warning in his tone. He had made his position clear. This marriage would be about duty and mutual benefit, nothing more. She could accept that. She had to accept that. "What would you have me do now, Your Majesty?" "You will remain at court to begin learning the duties of a queen. Lady Catherine Hartwell will serve as your guide in matters of protocol and court etiquette. A seamstress will be assigned to create an appropriate wardrobe, and you will begin meeting with the various court officials who will be expecting your support once we are wed." "And Marcus?" "A royal physician and escort will depart for your estate tomorrow morning. Your son will be in the capital within the week, and his treatment will begin immediately." Adrian returned to his desk, effectively dismissing her. "You may go. Lord Weston will provide you with the details of your new schedule." Eleanor curtsied deeply. "Your Majesty." She was almost to the door when his voice stopped her. "Lady Ashworth." "Yes, Your Majesty." When she turned back, she found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I hope you understand what you've given up for this bargain. There will be no going back." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "I understand completely, Your Majesty, and I have no regrets." As she left the study and walked back through the castle corridors, Elena felt as if she were floating. Marcus would live. He would have the treatment he needed, the best physicians, a future stretching before him bright with possibility. The price was her own happiness, her own dreams of love and companionship. But as she thought of her son's fever-bright eyes and labored breathing, She knew she would pay it 1,000 times over. She was going to marry the Frost King, and somehow she would find a way to make it work. Chapter 7. The Healing Begins. Elena's hands trembled as she stood at the window of her chambers, watching the royal carriage wind its way up the castle approach. After 6 endless days of court etiquette lessons, dress fittings and formal introductions to officials who would serve under her as queen, the moment she had dreamed of was finally arriving. Marcus was coming home to her, not to their crumbling manor but to safety, to healing, to life itself. The carriage drew to a halt at the main entrance, and Elena pressed her face to the glass, her heart racing as she watched the door open. Royal physician Dr. Edmund Fairfax emerged first, a distinguished man with silver hair and kind eyes, who had overseen the finest medical college in the kingdom for over 20 years. Behind him came Captain Morrison, and then, "Marcus," Elena whispered, her voice breaking on his name. Her son stepped carefully from the carriage, wrapped in a fur-lined cloak that was far finer than anything he had ever worn. Even at a distance, she could see how the journey had exhausted him, but he was here alive, and that was all that mattered. Elena lifted her skirts and ran from her chambers, propriety forgotten in her desperate need to hold her child. She burst through the main entrance doors just as the group was approaching, and Marcus looked up at the sound. His face, still too pale, still too thin, but bearing the first hint of hope she had seen in months, broke into the smile that had been her anchor through 6 years of widowhood. "Mama!" Elena dropped to her knees on the marble steps, catching Marcus as he stumbled into her arms. She held him close, breathing in his familiar scent, feeling the rapid flutter of his heartbeat against her chest. He was warmer than when she had left him, and though he was still fragile, there was a strength in his embrace that hadn't been there before. "My brave boy," she whispered into his hair. "How do you feel?" "Better," Marcus said, pulling back to look at her with eyes that seemed brighter already. "Doctor, Fairfax has been giving me medicine that tastes terrible, but it makes the burning in my chest go away. And Mama, the carriage was so grand. It had cushions softer than clouds and windows of real glass." Elena laughed through her tears, touching his face with gentle fingers. "I'm so glad you're here, my darling, so very glad." "Lady Ashworth," Dr. Fairfax approached with a respectful bow. "If I may, the young master has responded remarkably well to the initial treatments. The fever has broken completely, and his breathing has improved significantly. With continued care, I am optimistic about his recovery." "Thank you," Elena said, rising but keeping one arm around Marcus. "Thank you for bringing him back to me." "The journey was my pleasure, my lady. Master Marcus proved to be excellent company, curious about everything, well-mannered, and brave beyond his years." Eleanor felt pride swell in her chest. Even in his illness, even in strange circumstances, Marcus had conducted himself as the gentleman his father would have wanted him to be. "Now then," Dr. Fairfax continued, "I should like to examine the young master more thoroughly and begin the next phase of his treatment. His Majesty has ordered that a suite of rooms be prepared adjacent to the medical wing, comfortable quarters where Master Marcus can rest and recover while remaining close to care. Will I be able to stay with him?" Elena asked quickly. "Of course, my lady. His Majesty was quite specific that you should have every access to your son during his recovery." Elena felt a flutter of surprise at Adrian's consideration. She had not expected such thoughtfulness from a man who claimed to have no patience for children or sentiment. "Mama," Marcus said, tugging at her hand, "Dr. Fairfax told me about the king. He said you're going to marry him and become a real queen. Is that true?" Elena knelt again so they were at eye level. "Yes, my darling. In 3 weeks' time I will marry King Adrian. Will that make me a prince?" "A sort of prince, yes. But more importantly, it means you'll be safe and healthy and have the finest education in the kingdom." Marcus considered this seriously, his expression far too mature for an 8-year-old. "Will the king be my new father?" The question pierced Elena's heart. "He will be your stepfather, Marcus. No one could ever replace your papa, but King Adrian will provide for you and protect you. Does he like children?" Elena hesitated, unsure how to answer honestly without frightening Marcus. "The king is a very serious man with many responsibilities, but he has already ensured you have the best medical care possible, which shows he cares about your well-being." It wasn't quite an answer, but Marcus seemed satisfied. "When can I meet him?" "When, Doctor?" "Fairfax says you're strong enough for a formal introduction." As they made their way into the castle, Eleanor's mind raced with new concerns. Marcus would need to learn court etiquette, would need to understand the complex dynamics of royal life. He would need to navigate the expectations of being a royal stepchild while maintaining his own identity. Most challenging of all, he would need to form some kind of relationship with Adrian, a man who had made it clear he had no particular fondness for children. But those were worries for tomorrow. Today, her son was alive and healing, and that miracle was enough to sustain her through whatever challenges lay ahead. Chapter 8. The King's Unexpected Gentleness. 3 days later, Eleanor stood outside the doors to Adrian's private study, Marcus's small hand clasped firmly in hers. Dr. Fairfax had pronounced the boy strong enough for a brief formal introduction to his future stepfather, though Eleanor's nerves suggested she was far less prepared for this meeting than her son was. "Remember what we practiced," she whispered to Marcus. "A proper beau speak only when spoken to, and address him as Your Majesty." "I remember, Mama," Marcus replied, though his voice carried a tremor of nervousness. He looked especially small in his new court clothes, fine wool doublet in deep blue, matching hose, and leather shoes that had been crafted by the royal cobbler. But his color was better than it had been in months, and his breathing was steady. Elena knocked, and Adrian's familiar voice bade them enter. The king stood behind his desk, papers spread before him as if he had been reviewing state business. He looked up as they entered, his grey eyes taking in Elena first before settling on Marcus, with an expression Elena couldn't quite read. "Your Majesty," Elena said, dropping into a curtsy. "May I present my son, Marcus Ashworth?" Marcus stepped forward and executed a perfect bow, just as Elena had taught him. "Your Majesty," he said clearly, "I am honored to meet you, and I thank you for your kindness to my mother and me." Adrian studied the boy for a long moment, and Elena held her breath. This first meeting would set the tone for their entire future relationship, and she had no idea what to expect from a man who claimed to have no patience for children. "Rise, young master," Adrian said finally, his voice gentler than Elena had ever heard it. "How are you feeling?" "Much better, Your Majesty, thank you. Dr. Fairfax says my lungs are clearing, and I can breathe without pain now." "That is good news indeed." Adrian moved around his desk, approaching them slowly. Elena noticed that he had unconsciously modulated his movements, making them less sharp and intimidating. "Dr. Fairfax tells me you are an intelligent boy with many questions about the world." Marcus brightened visibly. "Yes, Your Majesty, I love to read, and I'm very curious about, well, everything. Papa always said curiosity was the beginning of wisdom." Something flickered across Adrian's features at the mention of Marcus's father. Not irritation, as Eleanor had feared, but what looked almost like approval. "Your father was a wise man," Adrian said simply. "Tell me, what subjects interest you most?" "History, Your Majesty, and mathematics. And I love maps. Dr. Fairfax showed me a map of the kingdom during our journey, and I memorized all the major cities and rivers." "Did you indeed?" Adrian moved to a cabinet and withdrew a detailed map, spreading it across a side table. "Show me." Marcus approached eagerly, his earlier nervousness forgotten as he pointed to various locations and recited their names with impressive accuracy. Adrian listened with what appeared to be genuine attention, occasionally asking questions that revealed the boy's knowledge was indeed extensive for his age. "Very good," Adrian said when Marcus had finished his recitation. "Tell me, what do you know of military strategy?" Elena tensed, unsure where this line of questioning was leading, but Marcus's eyes lit up with excitement. "Papa taught me about the great battles of King Aldred's reign and how he used the mountains to defeat armies twice the size of his own. He said terrain is often more important than numbers. Your father taught you well." Adrian studied the boy thoughtfully. "Would you like to learn more about such matters?" "Oh yes, Your Majesty, very much." "Then we shall arrange for proper tutors. A future prince should understand the arts of both war and peace." Elena's heart swelled with gratitude and surprise. Adrian was not merely tolerating Marcus, he was engaging with him, showing interest in his education and development. "Your Majesty," Marcus said suddenly, his child's directness overcoming court protocol, "are you going to take good care of my mama? She's been very sad since Papa died, and she worries about everything all the time." The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Elena felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. "Marcus." "It's quite all right," Adrian said quietly, his eyes never leaving the boy's face. "It's a fair question." He knelt down so he was at Marcus's eye level, a gesture so unexpected that Eleanor almost gasped. "I give you my word, young master, that your mother will be treated with all the respect and care due a queen of this realm. She will want for nothing, and no harm will come to her under my protection. And you won't make her cry?" Adrian paused, and Elena saw something vulnerable flicker across his features before the mask of control returned. "I will do my best to ensure your mother has no cause for tears." Marcus studied the king's face with the serious intensity only children possessed. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him, because he nodded solemnly. "Thank you, your majesty. I think Papa would approve of you taking care of us." Eleanor saw Adrian's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, and she realized this simple acceptance from her son had affected him more than he cared to show. "You honor me with your trust," Adrian said, rising to his full height. "Now, I believe Dr. Fairfax is waiting to continue your treatments. You may go." Marcus bowed again, then surprised everyone, including himself, by adding, May I visit you again sometime, your majesty? I have so many questions about the kingdom." "You may," Adrian replied after a moment. "We shall arrange regular meetings for your education." As Elena and Marcus left the study, Elena felt a strange warmth in her chest. Adrian had been kind to Marcus, not merely tolerant, but genuinely interested and patient. Perhaps there was more to the Frost King than his reputation suggested. Perhaps, despite his warnings about expecting nothing, there was still some capacity for human connection buried beneath all that ice. She dared not hope for too much, but as she watched Marcus chatter excitedly about his meeting with the king, Eleanor allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this arrangement might work out better than any of them had expected. Chapter 9. The Crown's Weight. The morning of her wedding dawned grey and misty, as if the heavens themselves were uncertain about the union taking place within Castle Ravenshallow's walls. Elena stood before the tall windows of the Queen's chambers, rooms that had been closed since Isabella's death 6 years ago, watching servants scurry across the courtyard below like ants preparing for rain. In just 4 hours, she would become Queen Eleanor of Aldermere. The thought still seemed surreal, even after 3 weeks of intensive preparation. "My lady," came a soft voice behind her. Eleanor turned to see Mary, the young maid who had been assigned as her personal attendant, approaching with a silver tray bearing tea and delicate pastries. "Lady Catherine thought you might need some nourishment before the ceremony." Eleanor managed to smile. Catherine Hartwell had become an unexpected ally during the wedding preparations, guiding Elena through the countless protocols and traditions that would govern her new life. More than that, she had become something Elena hadn't dared hope for, a friend. "Thank you, Mary. Has there been any word about Marcus this morning?" "Dr. Fairfax reports he slept well and his fever remains completely gone, my lady. The young master is quite excited about the ceremony. He's been asking the staff all sorts of questions about royal weddings." Eleanor's heart warmed. Marcus had thrived during their weeks at court, growing stronger each day under Dr. Fairfax's care. More surprisingly, he had begun to form a genuine attachment to Adrian, eagerly anticipating their twice-weekly meetings where the king would teach him about statecraft, military history, and the responsibilities of leadership. "My lady," Mary continued hesitantly, "if I may say so, you look nervous." Eleanor laughed softly. "Is it that obvious?" "Perhaps a little. But if it helps, the entire castle staff is quite fond of you already. You're kind to everyone, from the lowest scullery maid to the highest lord. That's not always been the case with nobility." Before Elena could respond, there was a knock at the door. Catherine swept in, magnificent in dark purple silk that complemented her golden hair, followed by 2 seamstresses carrying what could only be Elena's wedding gown. "Good morning, my dear," Catherine said, kissing Elena's cheek. "Are you ready to become a queen?" Eleanor's breath caught as she saw the dress. It was beyond anything she had imagined, ivory silk so fine it seemed to shimmer with its own light, embroidered with silver threads in patterns of roses and vines. The neckline was modest but elegant, the sleeves long and fitted, the skirt designed to trail behind her in a regal train. A matching cloak of midnight blue velvet would complete the ensemble, fastened with a silver brooch bearing the royal arms. "It's beautiful," Eleanor whispered. "Adrian chose the design himself," Catherine said quietly. "He said it should reflect both dignity and grace, qualities he believes you possess." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm. Adrian had been distant but not unkind during their wedding preparations. meeting with her regularly to discuss her future duties and ensuring she had everything needed for the ceremony. But he had maintained the emotional distance he had promised, treating her with formal courtesy rather than any personal warmth. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of preparation. Helena was bathed in rose-scented water, her hair arranged in an elaborate style that incorporated strands of pearls, her face painted with subtle cosmetics that enhanced her natural beauty without making her look artificial. When the seamstresses finished lacing her into the gown, Eleanor hardly recognized herself in the mirror. "You look every inch a queen," Catherine said with satisfaction. "Adrian won't be able to take his eyes off you." "This isn't about attraction," Eleanor reminded her gently. "This is a practical arrangement." "Perhaps," Catherine said with a mysterious smile, "but even practical arrangements can develop into something more, given time and patience." A trumpet fanfare echoed through the castle, announcing that the ceremony would begin in 1 hour. Eleanor's stomach fluttered with nerves as Mary placed the delicate silver circlet that would serve as her crown upon her carefully arranged hair. "My lady," Mary said softly, "Master Marcus asked me to give you this." She handed Eleanor a small piece of parchment folded carefully. Eleanor opened it to find a drawing in Marcus's careful hand, a stick figure woman in a crown, standing next to a tall man, with a smaller figure between them. Beneath it, in his best writing, were the words, "My new family. I love you, Mama. Papa would be proud." Elena pressed the drawing to her heart, feeling tears threaten her carefully applied cosmetics. Marcus's acceptance of this new life, his genuine affection for Adrian, had been the greatest gift she could have asked for. Another fanfare sounded, and Catherine took Elena's arm. "It's time, my dear. Are you ready?" Elena took a deep breath, thinking of Marcus healthy and happy, of Adrian's unexpected gentleness with her son, of the future stretching ahead of them. It might not be the love match she had shared with Thomas, but it was built on stronger foundations than many royal marriages: mutual respect, clearly defined expectations, and a shared commitment to protecting what mattered most. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it. Chapter 10. The Union of Ice and Fire. The great cathedral of Ravenshollow had been transformed into a vision of royal grandeur. Hundreds of candles cast dancing light across stone walls, hung with tapestries in the royal colors, and the air was thick with the scent of roses and incense. Every seat was filled with nobles from across the kingdom, all dressed in their finest attire to witness this historic union. Elena walked down the long aisle on the arm of Lord Chancellor Weston, who had graciously agreed to give her away in the absence of family. Her train whispered against the stone floor, and she was acutely aware of hundreds of eyes following her progress. But her own gaze was fixed steadily ahead, where King Adrian waited at the altar. He looked magnificent, in formal robes of black velvet trimmed with silver, a crown of dark metal resting on his black hair. Even at a distance, his presence commanded the vast space, and Elena felt that familiar flutter of intimidation mixed with something she didn't want to examine too closely. As she drew nearer, she could see his face clearly. His expression was calm, controlled, revealing nothing of whatever thoughts might be running through his mind. But his eyes, those storm-grey eyes that seemed to see everything, tracked her approach with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. When she reached the altar, Lord Weston placed her hand in Adrian's and stepped back. Adrian's fingers were warm and strong around hers, steady and reassuring despite the formal nature of their union. Archbishop Manning, the highest religious authority in the kingdom, began the ancient ceremony with words that had joined royal couples for centuries. Elena tried to focus on the ritual, on the responses she had practiced, but found herself distracted by Adrian's presence beside her. He was so tall that she had to tilt her head to meet his eyes when required, and his voice when he spoke, his vows, was deep and resonant, carrying clearly through the cathedral. "Do you, Adrian Blackthorne, King of Aldermere, take Elena Ashworth to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part?" "I do," Adrian replied, his voice steady and sure. "Do you, Elena Ashworth, take Adrian Blackthorne, King of Aldermere, to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part?" Elena's voice was clear as she answered, "I do." The archbishop blessed their union and called for the rings. Adrian slipped a band of white gold set with sapphires onto Elena's finger. Beautiful, valuable, but not ostentatious. When Elena placed the matching ring on his hand, she noticed his fingers were slightly rough despite his royal status, as if he still practiced sword work regularly. "By the power vested in me by God and the kingdom of Aldemir, I now pronounce you husband and wife, king and queen. You may kiss your bride, your majesty." This was the moment Elena had been dreading, their first kiss performed before hundreds of witnesses with no emotion behind it save duty and formality. Adrian turned to face her fully, his hands coming up to frame her face with surprising gentleness. For a moment, their eyes met, and Elena thought she saw something flicker in his gaze, uncertainty perhaps, or even tenderness. Then his lips brushed hers, soft and warm and achingly brief. It was barely more than a whisper of contact, yet Elena felt it resonate through her entire body. When he pulled back, his expression was carefully neutral again, but she could have sworn his breathing had changed slightly. "Long live the king! Long live the queen!" The cry rose from the assembled nobles, echoing through the cathedral as the cathedral bells began to ring, announcing the union to the entire kingdom. As they walked back down the aisle together, Elena's hand resting on Adrian's arm, she caught sight of Marcus in the front row. Her son was beaming with pride, his face bright with health and happiness. Beside him sat Dr. Fairfax, Catherine, and other members of what was becoming their extended family. The wedding feast that followed was a grand affair in the castle's great hall, with course after course of elaborate dishes and entertainment, by the finest musicians and performers in the kingdom. Elena found herself seated beside Adrian at the high table, aware that every gesture and interaction between them would be scrutinized for signs of the relationship's true nature. Adrian was attentive without being warm, ensuring her wineglass was filled and that she received the choicest portions of each dish. They made polite conversation about the guests, the ceremony, and her impressions of court life. To any observer, they appeared to be a king and queen comfortable with each other, if not passionately in love. As the evening progressed and the wine flowed more freely, the atmosphere became more relaxed. Elena found herself actually enjoying some of the conversations, particularly with the younger nobles, who seemed genuinely interested in her background and perspectives. "You've made quite an impression," Adrian said quietly during a lull in the festivities. "Lord Pemberton has been singing your praises for the past hour." "He's very kind," Elena replied, "though I suspect he's being diplomatic." "Pemberton is many things, but diplomatic isn't one of them. If he says you're intelligent and charming, he means it." Adrian paused, seeming to consider his words. "You've handled today admirably. The kingdom is fortunate to have you as queen." The compliment, unexpected and seemingly sincere, made Elena's cheeks warm. "Thank you, Your Majesty. I hope to prove worthy of the trust you've placed in me." "Adrian," he said quietly. "In private you may call me Adrian. We are married now, after all." It was a small concession, but it felt significant. "Thank you, Adrian." As the evening wound down and guests began to take their leave, Elena felt a growing nervousness about what would come next. The wedding night, another duty she would need to fulfill, another aspect of their arrangement that would test her resolve. But when Adrian rose from the table and offered her his arm, his voice was gentle. "Shall we retire, my lady? It has been a long day." As they walked through the castle corridors toward the royal chambers, Eleanor realized that despite all her fears and uncertainties, she felt a cautious optimism about their future. Adrian had shown unexpected depths of character, Marcus was thriving, and she had found her place in this complex world of royal duty and politics. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them as she had everything else, with courage, determination, and love for the family she was building, one careful step at a time. The beginning of their story together was just that, a beginning, and for the first time in years, Eleanor found herself looking forward to seeing how the story would unfold.